explaining our governance and how we make political transitions, we just look at tribe. And if you're sitting in Kenya and elsewhere, there is a fixation with personalities and regions, and a near blindness to the complexity of layers of interest and collusion that happens when you are transiting from one set of elites to another. And it's important that I use the term transiting from one set of elites to another and not transfer of power, in the sense that in most of these, no matter how articulate, no matter how popular, and no matter how big their mass following, most of our political leaders are merely marketers or PR stuntmen for much deeper set of interests within the deep state. And it is useful to understand this because often our analysis will look at where is this person from, what tribe do they belong to, so what is the tribal game? And we don't pay attention to the military, to the lumpenized elements that I talked about, to the financialization of the financial interest, to the theocratization of the faith and religious interests. And we take a single lens. And I want to suggest to you that in thinking about managed transition, it is useful that we take that approach in explaining our governance and our politics, which will bring you to a question of, and I'll come back to it, what are the changes that we observe in our politics? Now, if you think what I have described about lumpenization and so on and so forth, is decision-making is no longer as hierarchical as our generation. By our generation, I mean all those people who are between the ages of 35 and 75 who are on this call. Decision-making is more diffuse. The spaces and places where decisions are made are different. I've been asking a lot of people this question, Chairperson. Do people follow politics, or does politics now follow people? Let me explain that because it's useful as we are doing a conceptualization of how we manage transitions. So we previously believed that all transitions since the origins of humanity could be explained using a theory of root cause, or using the idea of a nucleus or a defining moment, or an origin or a beginning, such that when you're talking about the nature of transition in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda, you'd go to that one event, that one defining moment, and trace it in a linear fashion, right? Using, and in Western thinking, this is the tree of life mythology, that there are causes and effects, right? That everything, people act in their self-interest, or if you take Freud's Oedipus complex, that all psychological conditions can be traced to one traumatic moment, or Noam Chomsky's syntax tree. This idea of strong roots that are necessary in order to make a transition thrive. This idea that the identity of any political culture or a political culture is traceable through this linearity is something that we need to challenge. And it's something that history and developments in our countries are challenging. The first one, that idea of the tree of life, that reasoning, syntax tree or Oedipus complex suggests that there are hierarchically structured systems that determine what happens in society and what is higher order development or lower order development. It misses the interconnectedness of what I was referring you to: military interests, lumpen elements, financial interests, the theocratic or religious interests, and the ethnic. That interconnectedness, that intersectionality of interest or irritation is an important component in understanding how and why certain transitions are managed in one way and not the other, and why certain transitions last longer than the other. And why is this important? We live in the age of the internet, which you can say is rootless. It's a huge network with many parts that are connected to each other. The internet has no beginning and no end. There's no state of being, just a state of continuous becoming, continuously becoming something. finance capital and speculative capital, the same. So before you could go to one company, chairperson, that had an interest in Kenya, and you can trace that one company, and you still can trace some companies. But there is a whole set of players, whether it's in the deep, dark web or within the financial services sector, that have neither domicile or they're just speculative. These are merchants. Some of them are indigenous, some of them are regional, some of them are international. And that is why when you end up with a whole shipload of guns on the coast of Kenya, and nobody can explain what the guns are for, you get to understand the link between shadowy financial interests and military components, and even our security. So it would appear, chairperson, that the new social contract that any political transition would be considering must look at this intersectionality and interconnectedness. And in the region that we are in East Africa, it is no longer sufficient to use tribe as the reference point only. And it is no longer sufficient to use history as the only determining factor. We would need to look at what are the future interests of our colleagues from the Gulf, future interests of China, future interests of the Europeans and the Americans. And never mind the ideas and ideals they propagate around democracy and accountability. We now know that throughout the world, where there's been a conflict between their ideals, their ideas and strategic interests, the latter, the strategic interests, have always prevailed. So it would seem to me, if we want to properly conceptualize managed transitions, it is not helpful to look at the typologies, because the typologies will have different consequences and don't have predictable consequences. Let me explain. Nigeria transitioned in the late 80s from military rule to democracy under Obasanjo. By and large, the consensus amongst Nigerians is this did not cure corruption. It may have put corruption on steroids, but this was the moment where the strongest anti-corruption entities were set up and civic consciousness around fighting corruption grew. And also it's a moment that enabled consecutive civilian transfers of power following Obasanjo's rule. But what was the context? And Nigerians will tell you this. What was the context? The context was a group of people who had been military rulers before, that are commonly referred to as Nigeria Inc., retained capacity, not formally written anywhere, to determine the leadership and governance of the country. And therefore the transfer of power, although done in a civilian way through an election, always happened according to what the deep state or the unstated determined. Let's take a country like Zimbabwe. One ruler throughout all the time, but were there transfers of power even under single rulership? And what were those transfers of power? And what am I referring to as power? We see the growth and change, metamorphosis of an elite. It was not the same economic elite. We paid little attention to the evolving economic elite within the Zimbabwean context. And that evolving economic elite was fundamental and useful, finally, in connecting with the lumpenized elements within the ruling party and with the military elements in the transaction of the coup, or the so-called coup d'etat. And the non-attention or inattention to that evolving economic elite enabled not just by the political elite, but by sophisticated external interest. This was interest from the Gulf, interest from the United Kingdom, interest from Europe, interest from Asia, was able, without any notice to anybody else, to restructure not the state, but to restructure the political caste, the political leadership, without transforming the nature and structure of political power, without comprehensive state reforms. It would appear, therefore, Chairperson, that if we look at these two extreme examples, which typify the deep state in many respects, our conceptualization must avert this end of history cycle that says we were before non-democratic single party, then we became a multi-party democracy, and therefore our problem right now is our multi-party democracy is not delivering. That is overly simplistic to the extent that if it does not look at the interconnectedness and intersectionality. So in our democracies, ethnicity and tribalism, which characterize the pre-democratic moment, if democracy is being described in liberal terms as multi-party, is there. The second thing, the role of religion is still there. The role of the military is still there. But is this a uniquely African problem? No. America has an embedded securocracy in its governance. And in fact, for many years, the determination of their presidency was based on whether or not one was a veteran or their position with respect to military interests or the National Rifle Association. So it would seem if it's not unique to Africa, I could give European examples of managed transition. We must ask what therefore are the switches, not what is the switch in any transition. And I want to suggest to you, Chair, and to the audience, that the switch as we conceptualize transition, the switch as we conceptualize managed transition are the following, the switches. And I will prepare to end my presentation with those remarks. Number one, change speaks to some form of transformation from one state to another, which is driven by and owned by the people, informed by a clear ideological or at least normative lens, and that seeks to achieve fairly measurable, comprehensive state and economic reforms. That therefore, if this is the one switch to change, it matters in any transition where the economic power lies, both formal and informal. It also matters in any transition what the dominant economic interests, both current and future, are. It therefore matters what the interest clusters are. Which are the dominant interest clusters? And notwithstanding their distinction, what is the driving ideological framework for these interest clusters? It would seem to me, conception of transformation and transition has been limited not by political elites only, but by civil society. Often we have been reductionist in thinking that if we have a government that does not inhibit the press, if we have a regime that does not incarcerate opponents, that therefore we have democracy. And so we have managed to create spaces for people to shout at a non-transforming structure of power that's almost set like concrete. And it is therefore important in the imagination of this that we are actually robust and radical. The second thing is the idea of permanent revolution. It seems to me that we measure these managed transitions based on who comes in, how they come in, as opposed to what change it can and they can deliver. So we had a managed transition in 1980 in Zimbabwe, and we had a managed transition in South Africa, 1994-96. Those managed transitions delivered the following: new constitutions, Chapter 9 institutions for South Africa, a new era where people could demonstrate. But what they did not deliver, which was fundamental to whether it was a transition at all, was no delivery in terms of the condition of the people in socio-economic terms. And I wish to reiterate this point because my friends who are lawyers and human rights activists have only because of Corona begun to pay attention to the long neglected business of the socioeconomic and livelihood context of societies that transition politically without transitioning economically and socially. And lastly, Chair, what is therefore the difference between how we talk about Africa and how we talk? Africans talk about succession from Cape to Cairo. I have never heard anyone talk about the American succession issue. The very fact that in our narrative, we talk about succession and we talk about democracy and we talk about leadership and we talk about transition shows a problem, a crisis of imagination that we must ourselves embrace. What is that crisis of imagination? The idea that either the existing leadership or a political class or party has the right to groom a successor in a democracy, as opposed to the free expression and capacity of citizens to choose will surface a successor. Fundamental problem number one, because we are essentially accepting that our transitions, whether they happen through a free and fair election or a coalition, must be managed. And that management is hierarchical and that management is dominated. If we continue to talk about succession, then our narrative about managed transition will not just be about its management, it will be about the total control of transitions by the same elites, the same interests that have always controlled it. If we continue to talk not just about succession, we continue to talk about political parties without asking, are they developmental? Are they purely electoral? Are they ethnic? We're essentially accepting the following, Chair. It will make no difference whether it's oranges, bananas, or apples in Kenya, as long as the fundamental questions are not answered. The change, what you are managing is a caste. What you are managing is a set of personalities. It will have absolutely no bearing on policy, no bearing on governance, and no bearing on transformation in the interest of citizens. So I wish to suggest that in my conceptualization, managed or controlled transitions typify not a failure of ethics on the part of those that preside over them, but a crisis of imagination on our part. Because until we imagine beyond the notion of succession, beyond the notion of stable movement from one set of elites to another, until we're willing to bring back onto the table a conversation that was happening in Sudan but remained incomplete, happened in Egypt, remained incomplete, and Burkina Faso remained incomplete. What is the space between revolution, reform, and transformation? Does transition describe anything in between that spectrum, or it is simply a way of keeping stable the interests of the elites? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that extremely brilliant opening that sort of gives a very powerful and wide-ranging set of remarks that should be good food for thought about how we should think about transition, ending with I think that idea of should we think of transition as what is the ambition of transition? Is it to reform? Is it to cause revolution, or is it to merely transform? So the spectrum of possibilities and the spectrum of levels of radical, the spectrum of levels of change between what existed and what comes next, and how transition manages, fulfills that. I think that's a very powerful way of ending it. And in between, you've talked about the various crises of power, authority, state, and talked about finally about our crisis of imagination. We can't imagine transition outside of the parameters that have been established for us by the elites, but also talked about what are the interests of the players that are in place in our political situations, including the very interesting ideas about that we should regard religion as an organized political force in our political societies. So we will now go to a set of presentations that speak to individual countries' experiences in relation to some of the things that Brian has talked about. We will start with Uganda, where the speaker is Miria Matembe, who is a former parliamentarian, both in Uganda and in the Pan-African Parliament, and also a former minister in the Uganda government. She's an author. She's written several books. Her latest book, The Struggle for Freedom and the Democracy Betrayed, which has a foreword by the former president of Tanzania, Benjamin Mkapa, discusses very much these types of ideas that Brian has already talked about. She's also a women and gender leader, expert, and activist in her own right. So we are extremely privileged that you were able to join us, and you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. I would like to thank the Kenyan Human Rights Commission for inviting me to share in this conversation. Certainly, I'm a politician. I'm not a stranger to African politics, especially the Kenyan politics. Particularly, I've been a participant, particularly in the areas of women and politics, constitution making process. When you are making your constitution, I was almost always there, influencing the process when it comes to gender issues, having been a member of the Uganda Constitutional Commission and a Constituent Assembly delegate in this country, and also in terms of election observation missions. And I remember when Kenya had that crisis, when so many thousands of people died because of an election, and they had to have internal displacement that part of spilled over to Uganda. I also got involved in terms of conflict resolution and that kind of thing. Therefore, when I was invited, I was very happy. I haven't had connections of late with Kenya, so I was very excited to join this debate. I thank you for the opportunity. What is interesting me, though, is that I'm following this presenter of the conceptualization, a higher academic person with all these words. Oh my goodness. What do we do now? Oh, sorry for that. How are we going to stop this phone? Sorry for that. There was a call on this iPad which intervened. Are you still hearing me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry for that. I hope there will be no other intervention. I was talking about coming in following that distinguished, eloquent speaker with so many difficult technical words. I come in with my simple language, which I usually use, and using my personal experience to look at Uganda in terms of this managed political transition. I want to say that Uganda is unfortunately a unique country. It is different from the rest of the African region in terms of political transition. In Uganda here, we have never experienced what we would call a political transition, where you look at handing off power from elected president to another elected president. While you, my colleagues, are grappling with the issue of managed political transition, for us, we are struggling with the question of total resistance to political transition, as of course expressed in the ruling party's name, which is called the National Resistance Movement Party, which is completely determined and committed to militarily resist any political transition of power from itself to anybody else. To take you briefly through what we've been having, we have been having military takeovers. At independence, of course, after that negotiated colonial handover, the colonialists handed over power to an elected government, which that is the only thing that came close to a political transition. And this elected government actually took 4 hours. It was the prime minister militarily overthrew the president and installed himself in power. And it went on up to 1979, when the military under Idi Amin overthrew Obote government and took over power. And in 1979, the UNRF overthrew Idi Amin's military government. And you can't imagine, but between 1979 and 1980, Uganda saw power change hands militarily 3 times, until in 1980, the military commission of UNRF handed over power to Milton Obote again, a conspirator with the commission, after a military massively rigged and contested sham elections that sent President Museveni to the bush. Now, in 1985, there was a mutiny, military mutiny, which overthrew the Obote II government and installed Tito Okello Lutwa as president. And in a matter of a few months, the mighty warrior Museveni, through a protracted people's bush war, overthrew Lutwa. So that is how far we went with militarism. When Museveni came to power, he was enthusiastically welcomed and perceived as a redeemer of Ugandans. Of course, with his manifesto 10-point program, which if was implemented would be far in development, and with his true analysis of Uganda's problem being a governance issue about greedy politicians who do not want to hand over power peacefully, he won Uganda's hearts, who were in fact hoodwinked and oblivious of the fact that he was a military man himself. And of course, after that, we made a people participatory constitution, very mindful of the leaders who don't want to leave power. We put their term limits and age limit in a bid to sort out the problem which President Museveni had identified. But since that time, Museveni has been transferring power from himself to himself, for himself and his clan. You can imagine a government that has Museveni, his wife minister, his sons, his son-in-law, his brothers, in-laws, all are the ones who are in power. In fact, I wouldn't say Museveni that he maneuvers even with these rich people, whatever, like the Brian was saying. For him, he has his clan, he has his army, he has his military, and they are ruling this nation for themselves. So as you can see or know, in military takeovers, power is not transmitted to anybody, it is just taken. Now, Museveni took over a country that had literally gone to the dogs at his 35 years of uninterrupted militaristic rule, not leadership, the country is now in the hands of robbers, sharks, lions, crocodiles, hyenas, name it. It has gone to that extent. At independence, when the colonial masters handed over the country to the local masters, who inherited the same oppressive, exploitive, manipulative type of rulership, which has continued up to today, except that the local masters introduced other ills, such as an insatiable greed for power and materialism, and extensively perfected the principle of divide and rule through ethnicity and tribalism. So in a nutshell, I would say Uganda has never been placed in the hands of the citizens. Ugandans have never received power to lead themselves. And to me, this is the crux of the matter. Transition of political power from the greedy, deceitful, manipulative, and exploitative elite class to the people themselves. For me, that is what I would like us to be addressing, not transfer of power from leader, this elite class to another, whether it is managed or not. But me, I would like to see where power goes to the people themselves, to the citizens of my country. So Uganda, I want to say that Uganda, like the biblical children of Israel, who left slavery in Egypt on 11-day journey to the promised land, spent 40 years in the desert, moving around the mountain rather than crossing over due to their slave mentality. No,
it's okay. It's still being seen. His hand went off at you.
Okay. What about you?
Brian is muted. For you,
okay. Are you listening?
We hear you very well,
Okay, sorry,
Mama
was
Miriam.
a bit of interruption,
Keep going.
which I don't
Very,
understand.
very good to listen.
Yeah, so like I was saying, the children of Israel, they were meant to go on an 11-day journey to cross over to the promised land. But because of their slave mentality, it took them 40 years in the desert, moving around the mountain. Right now in Uganda, we are at 58 years since independence. We have continued to move in the desert with almost no hope of ever crossing over. And I want to say, cry, my beloved country. Now, having portrayed this simple brief of Uganda's power holding, I want to say that although Uganda appears to be uniquely different, the governance in East Africa and Africa in general is not different. And for me, that is why I see that the most important transition conversation that should occupy our time should be the mental transition of the minds of the African people, what I would call mind shift. I want to say, without taking you from the topic itself, because I know that this is within, I want to say that Africans need to shift. We need to shift from our narrow, primitive, ethnistic, tribalistic, egoistic, and enslaved minds to an open, wide, and free mind that can reveal to us who we are, not what we think we are and are told we are. Whatever is going on in other continents, whether they are managing transition or not, at least they are not like Africans. Africans who have been laughing stock all these years. I want to say that we need to embrace the mind that reveals us what we have as a continent, the enormous resource wealth that has been squandered and robbed by those who call us poor and have turned us into beggars. This is the question I want addressed very, very squarely. We therefore need a mentality transition like yesterday, because I want to say that without a mind shift, you cannot have a successful political transition. And it is only when we have the successful political transition that we lead to other transitions, social, economic, or otherwise. We know very well, and we have always sung it, that we are a rich continent. We are certainly rich people with high intellect, as opposed to how we've been portrayed as foolish, poor, and beggars. We have great wealth, a continent, a resource center of all that is needed for our development. But our continent has been out there for grabs by foreigners and local robbers and looters. This is what pains me. This is what hurts me most. Africans must get sick and tired, sick and tired, and angry and restless enough to rise up and throw down the yoke of our oppressors from our necks. It has been far too long. And I want to say that in God's words, in his command to the people of Israel, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1, verse 6, we have stayed long on this mountain of foolishness. And it is time to break camp and free ourselves. The citizens of our nations have got to take power in their hands. As to how we should do that should be the subject and topic of discussion, rather than discussing how these managed, whatever it is. Because whether the political transitions are managed or not managed, whether they are politically free or whatever, as long as our mind is enclosed in stupid ethnicity, tribalism, and that nonsense, we cannot move anywhere. I want to give you one example, the Kenyan example. At one time when you had gone through the crisis of where Mwai Kibaki reached the elections from Odinga, and many people had died. We were in Kenya, we used to go there to hold conferences and so on. And people were telling me, you know, Honorable, there is no way a Luo can rule Kenya. And I told them, shut up, you must be hopeless, because that is the time when a Luo, Obama, had taken over the presidency of the whole by then, the fastest country, the superpower of the world, was being ruled by a Luo, when in Kenya they were saying a Luo cannot rule Kenya. These are the kind of things I'm talking about. I'm glad I was given opportunity to express my mind, and I want to be sure that I'm not out of this topic. I want to conclude by saying that it is my desire that this coronavirus pandemic, which has revealed to us the weaknesses of all those whom we've been hitherto seeing as strong and untouchable, becomes a wake-up call to us to rise up and look inside ourselves as a people and a continent, unite and build ourselves from within so as to transit from the shameful and shunned and despised continent to a continent that is able to utilize the resources, the riches that God gave us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Again, very, very good presentation that traces the history of Uganda's development, a transition that was negotiated from the departing colonial powers to the new Ugandan elite, and how power played and changed hands between those elites, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily through military coups, and how Museveni, a creature of that transfer, then took advantage and has dominated Ugandan politics for the last several years, and has expressed some of that domination through the way he has allowed his family to take such a strong foothold in the country's politics. But also tying in with some of what Brian said earlier to do with the state of mind of the people of this continent in terms of how we need to have a new imagination about how to govern ourselves, and without that new imagination about who we are and how our identities are part of the decision making about who governs us, it is impossible to make progress. So thank you very much for that presentation. We'll go to the last presentation in this segment. That is going to be a presentation on the Burundian situation. It's going to be made by Karine. Karine is I'm just about to introduce her better. Just give me a minute. Yes, so Karine is the Africa Advocacy Director for a period of about 15 years or over. She has more than 15 years experience in transitional justice and worked on the Arusha Peace Agreement. That is the peace agreement in relation to her native country, Burundi, and the LRA peace agreement as well. Her work currently is primarily with African human rights institutions. I've had the occasion to speak with Karine about some of these things, and she's got very fresh ideas about how African institutions can be managed in a way that has better outcomes for the population across Africa. And it is my pleasure now to give her the floor.
Thank you, George. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Let me just take this opportunity to just thank Kenya Human Rights Commission for having invited me. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you. Big shout at my brother Brian, my sister Honorable Miriam. Thank you very much for brilliant presentations. I don't know how one follows those two acts. So in terms of Burundi, I think I'll be discussing today what I think the title was a bit problematic for me. It said, managing political transitions. But I think in the case of Burundi, it's really managing the instruments of political transitions, namely the Arusha Peace Agreement, with a particular focus on the drivers of violence and peacemaking in Burundi. For those who might not be very familiar with my small country, I also see myself as an East African. I'm a daughter of Uganda, lived in Uganda, by the way, and Kenya. So I see myself really as East African more than anything. So for those who might not know Burundi, I think it's important to note that Burundi is a country whose history since independence has been marred with violent cycles of ethnically motivated violence since independence. And I'm saying this because I think the framework in which we're going to talk about Burundi, I know that the breaking news that have been coming out from Burundi is really about, obviously, the death of late President Nkurunziza and what is to be expected from this new political dispensation that we see. But one has to understand that the crisis, I think the political crisis, the most recent crisis, which started in 2015, was in the first place precipitated by the systematic manipulation of the legal and political settlement that ended a 12-year long Burundi civil war since 1993, when the first Hutu political figure democratically elected was assassinated. So what I'm going to really talk about is, it's on one hand, one has to really look at Burundi from two perspectives. The first one is the Arusha Peace Agreement and the Burundian constitution. And on the other is the failure of transformative politics, where you have the current political party in power, the CNDD-FDD, which used to be a rebel movement, turned into a political party, turned into a party in power, but which was tasked of delivering a peace agreement, which the party in question did not embrace and recognize right from the beginning. It's important to note that this peace agreement I'm talking about was signed in 2000 and under the auspices of mighty leaders such as the late Nelson Mandela, and before him, the late Tanzanian President Nyerere. And the peace agreement also influenced and in a way inspired other peace agreements, like the one in South Sudan, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the Inter-Congolese Dialogue in DRC. Lots of efforts, lots of political will were invested into that. And it's important to know that within that peace agreement, the definition of the nature of the conflict in Burundi is very important. And we don't necessarily often refer to that. It states that fundamentally that the nature of the conflict is political with extremely ethnic dimension, and that it stems from a struggle by the political class to access and or remain in power. And at the heart of the agreement, you have what you call a consortial agreement, which was obviously, no doubt, this was the first attempt, by the way, in Burundi history to provide a real solution to events that had torn it apart since independence. It provided for an undertaking by the parties to lead Burundians towards reconciliation by determining the truth about the origin and nature of the conflict. It proposed an institutional framework for the transition to bring about conditions for democratic renewal by fair power sharing. It brought about the end of hostilities, because at that time in 2000, you still had military factions that were fighting the administration at that time, and the establishment of security guarantees for all citizens through a reform of the army. And what I would like to now move onto is the fact that the Arusha Peace Agreement introduced several peacemaking and stabilization mechanisms. There was a minority protection, as you know. Can you hear me? Oops. Can you hear me? Not sure.
Yes, we hear you, Karine.
Okay. So I was talking about the fact that there was a minority protection for the Tutsis at that time, organized through political and military representation of minority groups. And insulation, talking about military coup d'etat, by introducing the notion of civilian supremacy over military matters, and the gradual correction of ethnic imbalances in the composition of defense and security forces. There was an institutional legitimacy based on the notions of legality, rule of law, and protection against interference by influential power holders. The governance structures and institutions, I would say, when the CNDD-FDD came into power in 2005, were largely based on the principles established in the Arusha Agreement and the 2005 Constitution that was established at that time. And the agreement served the country well at that time for the transition period. But as soon as the CNDD-FDD, with Nkurunziza as the president, took over power, we started to see a chipping away of the delegate mechanisms that were put in place to achieve parity under the Arusha Accords. And I would like to just say that from 2005 until 2015, we see Burundi within a context of rights erosion. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that you have, for instance, in 2012, a law governing opposition parties, talking about civic space and the rights of the opposition to actually rally and assemble, which imposes fines and prison terms for opposition leaders which were found guilty, between quotes and quotes, lies and slander. You have a law in 2015 prohibiting the formation of coalitions outside of the electoral campaigns periods. The issue of freedom of expression, which I think was defined by a booming civil society, an emergence of media outlets, which were deemed to be one of the some of the most active and dynamic in the region. You see you see the emergence of emblematic cases of disappearances, extrajudicial killings, suspending the CNDD-FDD started to suspend basically local associations one after the other. So we see lots of activities, especially after 2015, of activities of foreign non-governmental, for instance, organizations. I'm going to now talk about, I think, one of the key elements that really, when we talk about managing a political transition, has been very problematic. And that is the rise of the militia group called Imbonerakure, which is the youth wing affiliated to the CNDD-FDD in power. Members of the youth wing, they've been identified as a major driver of insecurity, with having been for a long time implicated in violence and intimidation targeting CNDD-FDD perceived opponents, civil society members, widespread violations including rape, beatings, extrajudicial killings. And it should be also remembered that there was, as the CNDD-FDD was in power, there was another Hutu, in majority, Hutu-based group called this FNL now, which has been rebranded as CNL, and Imbonerakure members were implicated in attacks against members of that group. And the Imbonerakure over the years have grown in numbers to such a degree that in some areas they have taken over local administrative authorities and the police. And obviously the government has been claiming that the activities of the group is just that it's merely a youth wing like any other party's youth group. And the role and visibility of the Imbonerakure in Burundian politics has shifted over time. It's important to realize that as we talk about a transition, as a country and a political elite shifts with time, we also saw changes in the calculus of the CNDD-FDD. And let me just say that whether it's the United Nations, whether it's Human Rights Watch and other organizations, international organizations, have raised the alarm about the crackdown that we saw increasing with time. But we all agree that the current crisis was really defined, took a turn for the worse in 2015, when again, the CNDD-FDD announced that Pierre Nkurunziza, the late president, will be the party's presidential candidate in the 2015 elections. I'm not going to talk about the fact that when we think of the instruments to manage any transition, we also have to take into consideration the constitution that was at that time, which the constitution and the Arusha Peace Agreement both were read by some, did not allow the president to run for a very controversial third term. He did. And I'm going to take the discussion into 2015 now. What was the context? There was a national context. There was a regional context as well. And I think it's important to know that 2015, as I mentioned earlier, was a time when Burundians saw the possibility to move away from a rule that many saw as increasingly authoritarian and threatening in many ways. There was a growing resilience within the civil society, as I mentioned. So the Burundian society was really ready to exercise, some of its constitutional rights to peacefully protest against the government. There was also another element, which was the public emergence of a rift within the CNDD-FDD, a group called the Frondeurs, which is a group of high-level CNDD-FDD officials who publicly denounced Nkurunziza and the party. And that would be the first important signal that the CNDD-FDD was faced with internal tensions, which will ultimately, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit, led to the stepping down of Nkurunziza. But 2015, it's also a brutal crackdown, as many of you saw in the news, and the repression in the aftermath of 4 attacks of a failed coup d'etat, 4 attacks against military barracks. There were attempts at overthrowing the CNDD-FDD at that time. And that would unleash a repression of such a magnitude that the African Union carried out a fact-finding mission, and the UN Commission of Inquiry was established. We also, in terms of some of the reactions, I think, outside of the region, there still is a UN resolution 2303 on the possible deployment of a police. There was the institution of the UN Special Envoy, Michel Kafando. And in 2016, we now saw the emergence of an EAC inter-Burundian dialogue, which was launched with Tanzanian former President Mkapa as the facilitator and President Museveni as the mediator. Now, that's a nice segue to now talk about the regional context. What was the regional context? And I think the first one is, and I think Brian mentioned it, it's within the region, what would have caused the CNDD-FDD to pause and Nkurunziza to pause and not run for a 3rd term when some of his most powerful neighbors have been in power for more than 20 years, right? The other one, the EAC is not ECOWAS. So the EAC was never really able to speak with one voice, with a one coordinated, strong voice, did not have really a clear vision of what would be its position in the event of a political crisis stemming from an incumbent running for an unconstitutional 3rd term, in the case of the population rising against that decision. And I would like to raise here the fact that we have an EAC protocol on democracy, good governance, and elections, but it's not ratified yet. So despite the fact that we have other regional instruments, I remember the ministers of foreign affairs of the region presented an opinion, but that was not followed on the 3rd term. So EAC as a region does not have a ratified protocol on good governance, does not have necessarily leaders who are ready to step down themselves. So there was not really a coordinated, a strong push from the region to really curtail the late President Nkurunziza's decision. And then I think you see, because of a lack of action, what we see in 2018, a referendum, a complete dismantling of the Arusha Peace Agreement, and the radicalization of the party in power. And I think one would say that the dismantling culminated into an orchestrated referendum in 2018, which endorsed a new constitution, which completely removed some of the key principles and mechanisms I've mentioned earlier. 2020, then you see the election, the decision by the National Assembly to elect President Nkurunziza as an entrenched supreme leader. You see the parliament voting to pay about $500,000 and to provide the president with a luxury villa when he leaves office. And the current president, Evariste Ndayishimiye, is elected. And I remember George asked me, so would you be, whether I would be able to speak about what really pushed Nkurunziza not to run for a fourth term? Ultimately, he had run for a third term, and he had a constitution, tied for that end. And according to my own reading and our own analysis from different sources, it could be that it stepped down because of three things. The first one, it's really an entrenched pushback from different factions within the party itself. The fatigue of the politics of isolation, because between 2015 and 2020, 5 years of a lot of pushback from the international community, the civil society, Burundian civil society in exile, rising numbers of refugees, had somehow resulted into some sort of isolation of the country, and again, probably quiet diplomacy from its traditional allies like Tanzania as well, who was also wondering probably where this was going to end. And what I would like to also mention here is the deepened political fractions. Ultimately, any nation, for any political dispensation, at some point for its vitality, needs some contested interest to be at play. You need contestation. You need different interests in any given country to be able to survive. At some point, the CNDD-FDD along the way find itself morphing into multi-layered power structures. So that's very important to understand. Having different blocks within the CNDD-FDD, the most powerful faction actually is known as the Committee of Generals. So you had power struggles, internal upheavals, and I think that leads to the nomination, which we saw of some of the very the hardliners, really, the most prominent hardliners within the party, such as the General Alain Guillaume Bunyoni as Prime Minister, General Gervais, who's now known as, really by his nickname, I Will Kill You, and two or three officials who are under US and EU sanctions. It's important to note the role of ethnicity as well. And what I would like to say is that ethnicity is salient. And as much as we say that we should go beyond, and it should, like what Honorable Miriam said, we should really get rid of those concepts within African politics, but it's still there. It's salient in the efforts because when you think of the inclusion, cohabitation, cross-ethnic coalition building governed, how power was distributed within the Arusha framework. And these new political arrangements have replaced that system. And I think that's a worrying trend. And all that is really embedded within the CNDD-FDD's calculus of survival. It's important to note that. Someone asked me, how do we seek a stable way forward? I think the transition of power from Nkurunziza to the current president, which many seem to think that it's a quick and stabilizing solution to the death and some power vacuum a few weeks back, is very worrying, because the foreboding outlook is a direct, I think of Burundi is a direct result of the dismantling of the Arusha Peace Agreement. In a nutshell, that's what it is. And I think in order to avoid further deterioration, I think there's a 6-point roadmap that former President Mkapa had developed for the EAC inter-Burundian dialogue. And I think it provide a good place where to start. We need to see a commitment to a dialogue with political opponents. We need to see a disarmament of the Imbonerakure. We need to see impartial, transparent investigations. We need to see prosecution. We need to see a place where one must start speaking about justice. Justice for women who, up until now, we still receive endless accounts of women who have been either raped or are fearing being raped. We need to see a return of political exiles. We need to see the release of political prisoners, the return of refugees. And I would end by saying that Burundi is at a crossroads right now. We are yet to see where would the current administration, which turn they're going to take. Is it going to be a turn for the worse, or is it going to be some sort of gradual opening towards a political dialogue with their opponent, towards some sort of opening towards the region? Because Burundi has been also close to the region for a few years now. These are some of the signs that every Burundian, I guess, is waiting to see. I'm going to end my presentation here. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karine, for that fascinating presentation, starting with a history of, well, elements of the recent political history of Burundi, the conflicts, finally the Arusha Peace Agreement, which you played a role in monitoring and following and trying to support, and to the Nkurunziza years, and now ending with the crisis that Burundi faces. I think it's a crisis that is based on a perception, as you've said, that the death of Nkurunziza means that a solution has been handed over to the country, and that the problems that his reign and rule represented are have suddenly been overcome. And you've said that that is not the case. There are huge outstanding questions that have not been that would need to be addressed, and unfortunately there isn't a mechanism at the moment for addressing those questions, which are to do with if his success politically is the result of a repudiation of the Arusha Peace Agreement, then anything that represents a future, an agreed future for Burundi, would have to revisit the agreement and make a decision about how to reinstate or its spirit or elements of it, or how to speak to the things it was trying to achieve. But also, you've talked about how the consequences of Nkurunziza, I mean, the ongoing consequences of Nkurunziza's rule, political prisoners, exiles, the human rights transgressions, and also the needs for justice and disarmament that the country has, which remain unmet. So with those three presentations, one, an overview of the problems, and two, a presentation of two different countries and the challenges that they face, begin to establish for us how big and deep the problem we are talking about is, and how how different the situations in our different countries is, even though they are right next to each other and they seem to face exactly the same underlying problem, and that the complexity of the problem also underlines, I think, the fact that we have a complexity of solutions if we are to try and deal with the problem. We have I've seen very many questions in the chat, and a lot of them relate, I think not surprisingly, because a large number of people participating are from Kenya. A large number of them relate to Kenya, about which we will hear after the break when David speaks about it. So I would ask that if he has time to look at those and incorporate some of the things that have been said in the chat into his presentation, that would be useful. If he can't, then we'll have to find a way of following up with some of the questions and concerns beyond this webinar. It is now 3:30, almost 3:28 in Kenya. And we will take the 5 minutes break that we had promised. I'm aware that we haven't allowed a plenary, we haven't allowed a formal way to react to the speakers' presentations. I would encourage that people continue writing any reactions that they may have in the chat. We'll try and get a sample of those somewhere near the end, so that there can be a response if possible. If not, we'll carry the conversation forward, because I think this webinar wasn't did not pretend that it was going to be possible to answer all the problems of the region in one afternoon or morning meeting for some people. So they continue part of the concerns that need to be taken on board as we go forward. I should have said that I've seen very, very many friends and colleagues, old and new and future, in the chat. It is not possible to recognize any of you or to give any of you any special mention, because you are so many. I would like to say that you are all very, very, your presence here is a great honor to us as KHRC and as the Journalists for Justice, as the two hosting organizations for this webinar, and to ask that you continue with the presentation, to continue tuning in when we return after 5 minutes break. Now, so we take the break now, then I will introduce the speaker, the moderator for the next session. Yeah, we are on the break officially. Thank you very much.